Before I begin our sermon this morning, I do just want to thank the folks on the Christian Education Board because this service was actually the product of their idea. We were in our board meeting this past Wednesday, and a few of them said, why don't we do a hymn sing instead on Sunday as a way to provide pastoral care to our ministers who may not be in a place to find all the right words for the moment that we are currently in, but also because singing has this really wonderful thing, like Reverend Liz just said, to offer us all comfort food, to provide for us a space, the act of singing in unison together, breathing together, chanting together, moving through the pages together. All of that makes us feel just a little bit more whole, which we think you might need in this moment. Will you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, source of all that is and that shall be, God of beginnings and ends, of the cool gray sky, the soft falling rain, let us be attentive to your word and to your call for us on this day and in the days ahead. And in our time together this morning, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So in the Friday e-news note this week, I acknowledge the difficulty that many ministers may be feeling alongside you. And believe it or not, we are not some separate class of people who are unaffected by the events of the world. So this morning, this sermon is like three different things in one. I'm planting seeds for future longer sermons, but I just didn't quite have the energy this week to sit and write one full, totally complete sermon, and I trust that you will understand that. Psalm 127 is interesting, I think. Depending upon the translation that you read, it's pretty easy to focus on the latter half about children. One could also focus solely on the top half about the home. But when read together, I think you actually get a good entry point into a conversation about the role and the future of the church. There's a lot that goes into building a house. You need land, you need surveys, you need permits, contractors, a solid idea of what you want, design plans, money, and more. Turns out that most of us don't really want to put that much effort into our home. So we've made a whole industry instead out of rebuilding and renovating houses. There, too, a lot of thought goes into the process of taking a house as it is and hoping that through time and commitment that house will become your home. Easier said than done. This is why I think if you look closely at older homes, you can take a journey through all the fads and all the styles that were in vogue. This is how you end up walking through a Sears catalog home that now has a shiplap wall entryway, brass fixtures, a smart thermostat, a sunken living room, a basement with a shag carpet, barn doors for all the bedrooms, and a counter and bar stools that only fit because someone knocked out the kitchen wall so that the space might breathe a little bit more easily. Our houses tell stories about who and how we are. A few weeks ago, my mother and I visited my grandfather, and as we were sitting in the living room of his home, I had this sudden moment where I sort of recalled the old layout of his house. See, a decade or so ago, he qualified for a program that supported the near total renovation of his home. And it's interesting because while the current home is familiar, I couldn't help but recall that old design. In the front of the house was my grandmother's bed of ivy that crawled up and down the trellises of her porch. You'd open the door and immediately be inside the living room, with a bedroom off to the right and a bathroom there. If you walked further ahead, you'd be in the kitchen, the dining room, another room, and then in the very back, another room and another bathroom. The basement of that home was entirely just a dirt floor. I remember this home a lot because I spent a lot of my childhood there just visiting my grandparents. My mom asked me to get something from the car, and so when I went outside, it took a little bit longer for me to get back in because I walked around the side my grandfather's house. I walked past the creek bed where my grandparents once raised cabbage and where my siblings and cousins and I would weirdly make mud pies or something like that. And I kept walking because I was looking for a tree. I still don't quite know what led me to look for that tree, but towards the very back of the property of this house, there was once a really big weeping willow tree. And this tree was sort of the marker for how far all the adults would let their kids go without supervision. It was also the base for us for things like freeze tag and other games. This weeping willow tree was like the center point for all things for us to be safe. As I stood at the back of the yard, I could not find the tree. So I looked up. Surely I would see the weeping willows. That's not hard to miss. And yet, still, there was nothing there. So I thought, surely I haven't misplaced the tree's location in my memory. Like it would not be hard to miss. I looked around a little bit more. The same creek bed was still there. The grass was still there. The pile of dead limbs was back there where it's always been. The walnut trees that aggravate me, they were still there too. You have to walk carefully with the fruit of walnut trees because they're just like mushy tennis balls. And I don't quite get the point. But even they were still there. The weeping willow tree was not. And as I stood there, unable to find that tree that I think had perhaps been comfort food for me, I stood there wondering where it had gone, what had happened to it, and also I recognized its role in my life. In that moment, all of these memories came flooding back to me. And for a moment, I thought, gosh, I would do anything to go back to exactly what once was, for nothing to have changed. But here's the thing about old houses. They do change. They take just as much thought, just as much consideration, just as much faith in God to provide and faith in God to build together. I will tell you, my grandfather did not really want that house to be different. This is in part because my grandmother had died several years before, and she wouldn't get to see that new thing. But it's also because he had to change his lifestyle a bit. For decades, my grandfather used a kerosene heater to heat his home. And if you haven't been around a kerosene heater, it has a very distinct heat signature. It's hideous, kind of evil looking, in my opinion. But it also has a smell. It's just kerosene. And anyone who's around it, you're kind of like, I don't really want to be here, right? And so my hunch right now is that all the folks who come into my grandfather's living room and sit with him probably feel better, breathe more easily, and feel more at home precisely because he acknowledged that sometimes things in our homes have to change. And we can approach that with a lot of fear, anxiety, doubt. That's all healthy and it makes sense. And at the same time, with faith in God that we're not just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, new things, brighter things, more whole things might emerge. You may not be convinced that Psalm 127 is about that kind of house. Fine, that's okay. But it is very clearly about our labors and our hopes to build something that we want to and can be proud of. And so in that way, I think Psalm 127 can also be about the church and about society. Looking at the church, there are physical features of our churches, right? Take a look around this room. If you walk into really old churches, though, particularly in New England, or newer ones that happen to follow older architectural styles, you note that their sanctuary is often in a cruciform, or the shape of a cross. You have a long, narrow spot for the congregation to sit, called the nave. There will be a chancel, raised kind of like this. In older congregations, it's much, much higher. On the right, there would be a pulpit, several steps up, from which the minister would preach and offer the gospel. On the left would be a lectern, more like this, from which the liturgist would read. The gospel side, the epistle side. And if it's a really, really sort of traditional hierarchical type of church, at the very back you'd have a sacristy where robes and stoles would be stored, and there'd be a high altar from which the ministers would begin to prepare communion. Now, all that I've offered you right now are the physical features of that church. If you walk into a newer congregation, right, you might see something like this: a large wooden cross, a space that feels a bit more equitable between clergy and layperson, windows that go from the ceiling to the floor, a space that just feels more open and inviting. Here, too, what I've acknowledged for you are the physical aspects of the church. I was talking to Reverend Liz and Denise this morning, and we started talking a bit about space is cool, but the bigger part of a home is how you choose to live. So within all the things that already exist for us, how do we choose to live within that space and make this more like home? Yes, indeed, the walls and windows create boundaries for our spaces, but we get to choose what and how we do things here. In those endeavors, there will sometimes be hard conversations. There will sometimes be tears. There will be tough decisions that are made, some that make some of us really, really happy, that help us feel a bit more at ease, and some that make us really, really mad. But we would do well to ensure that in those conversations and decisions, that we are journeying with God. We build churches and houses of worship to honor and glorify God. I will say that again because I think that something happened with American Christianity when we built these really big congregations. We forgot the point. We build houses of worship. We build churches to honor and glorify God. And even though it might feel like a home for us, even though we rightfully may lay claim to some part of what happens here, we would do well not to place ourselves ahead of God in that work. What happens in this space is an effort to bring us intentionally more into focus on that cross, on our relationship with God, to then go back out into the world and share what we've received here. Gifts of grace, mercy, compassion, healing, love, care. We can create all the plans, have all the conversations, raise all the money and more. But without careful and intentional engagement with God, our efforts will be in vain. Churches, like houses, change. Members move away, members die, new members come in and find some place that they can grab onto and take root here. Ministers come and go too. In all of that, every single person who enters into that space will be trying to make something there home. There will be give and take because this home doesn't really belong to any of us. The folks who came before built it with the idea that we would do good work here to again honor and glorify God. We get to decide how we live things out here, but because there's so much that changes, so much that's in flux, the way we live in this space might change too. That is not easy work, but here we are. The question that I think we should ask ourselves is, can we trust each other enough in the work of determining how we might do life here again and again and again? Can we trust each other enough to turn towards God and ask her what new things she might want us to do within this space? To ask her if there are things that we find hard to agree with, things that we don't quite like about things that may be happening in our midst, can we find it within ourselves to be humble enough to ask God to give us an opportunity to see even a glimpse of the vision that other folks might have for what's possible in places like this? Churches are like houses. They change. And again and again and again. Walk throughout any church and you will see all the things that have helped make it into what it is, right? The murals on the walls, The youth rooms, the choir rooms, all the things that make this place what it is physically will always be there, but we get to decide what those things might do to serve a different purpose as we grow and share in our common life. In this designated term that Reverend Liz is leading for us, I hope that we might all find in ourselves the ability to be humble enough to approach changes with a sense of humility, but also a chance of opportunity. Not to say accept exactly what it is because a minister or council told you it should be that way, but instead to provide and create space for yourself to ask and wonder, what is being asked of me in this moment? And are there things that I'm willing to give up to change so that something else might be able to come into fruition? And in those places where I find it hard to accept a change or move forward with change, can I at least accept the opportunity to engage in conversation about that which has been and that which might one day be? Change is hard, but I think sometimes indeed change is good. Because our houses of worship, much like the houses in which we live, it's where everything really does happen. It matters how we do things here. It matters whom we bring to the table. The last thing that I'll share with you all this morning, I think it would be awkward to not mention our election this past week. I think here too, Psalm 127 is a helpful guide. I said a few minutes ago that this psalm can speak about your family, about your church, but also about society at large. And part of the text that Barb read for us this morning, you would note the idea of protecting the city. That's clearly more than one individual house. It's been a bit difficult for me to sort of put into words exactly how I feel about all that's happened in this past week. It's particularly true because we spent 30 minutes in a sermon on Faith and Democracy Sunday, and then came back 2 weeks later, and maybe that sense of trust and faith was a bit shaken, a bit disturbed, a bit uncomfortable, right? I think what Psalm 127 invites us into in this particular moment is an opportunity to make clear to the world the type of house that we want to live in. We have a structure. It is this country. We have a system of government. It is a democracy. We get to decide how we want to live within that. And in the pastoral note that Reverend Liz and I sent to you all right before the election, there was a song included at the end called Crowded Table by the Highwomen. I was talking to Lisa earlier, and that's sort of the theme song for her life, and it's become sort of a theme song for mine too. I hope you're okay that I shared that. Because I think when we imagine the house that is our society, there's not really any other song that gets at it better than this for me. I want a house with a crowded table, with a place by the fire for everyone. If we want a garden, we're going to have to sow the seed, plant a little happiness, let the roots run deep. If it's love that we give, then it's love that we reap. If we want a garden, we're going to have to sow the seed. There's a lot more in that song that I think could speak to folks in this moment. I'm not Reverend Liz, so I'm not going to sing for you. But I will say that another big part of that song for me is the idea that there was someone in the house who will hold your hand, even if you don't want to hold on to something, even if you feel like you have to let go, that there's someone in that house who sees you, acknowledges you, loves you deeply enough to offer to you that which you might need in the moment and in the way that you might need to receive it. I will also say that I think there are ways for us to make our own homes, our genuine houses, different for us. When I think about my home, I will be clear that I will invite people over, more people over, folks with whom I may not have considered giving an invitation to before. And in that place, we will drink wine and break bread. We will dance, we will laugh, we will cry, we will live. We will do all of those things and more, if only so the powers of death and despair might know that they have not won, and that we are not defeated. I am not someone who believes that one election result should totally change the way we look at and think about the world. I understand that some of you may be those folks, and that may, I'll be honest, be a reality of the difference in how we look. People who look like me have been through many of these things before. It doesn't mean everyone's going to be okay. But for folks who are wondering, what do we do? I have to encourage you, stop reading books. Talk to actual people. Every single time something happens in this country, you rush to book clubs as if that's going to fix something. Stop reading books. Talk to people. And what you will find are a lot of answers that all these books that we read and that we've been trained to read are not going to give us. Engaging with people face to face where they are, I'm not saying reading is bad, believe me. But I am saying that for the place in which we are in, you will go a heck of a lot further having real conversations with people than you will be picking up 20 different books about the topic that you think is going on in the world. Engage with your neighbors more. Go to places that you might not ordinarily go, not for the sake of observation, but for the sake of actual, genuine engagement. Relationships like that are what will help us move further forward. Will help us better understand those things that we think we have no ability to understand. Invite people into your house. Build a bigger table. Be okay with a crowded table. Start a fire, have room for everyone. That, I think, is one way that we can move somewhere different in this moment. I am glad that you are here, in person or online. I'm glad that on this particular day you chose to spend an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes here with us. And I hope that when you leave this place that you will be convinced, or at least open to the idea of building bigger community. If anything was made clear this past week, it is that our country remains deeply divided about core aspects of who and how we want to be in this house that is our country. And we can withdraw and turn inward, or we can turn outward. And we can genuinely make ourselves open to understanding all that might be happening in the world. Some of the answers are very simple. People happen to actually just be racist. People happen to also just be misogynist. And at the same time, there are folks who have deeply felt economic anxieties that are real. And we can point to charts and graphs and say, this is the best economy in the world. And yet for the single mother with 3 kids whose grocery bill went up 3 times in a year, those charts and graphs won't mean anything to her, right? There's an opportunity, I think, for us here to more deeply engage with the people with whom we share this life with. And that's going to be a little hard because our society's not really set up that way. We self-segregate based on education, race, class, all these things. We intentionally hide ourselves away from the rest of the world. I think what Psalm 127 invites us into, I think what God might be calling us into is a space to offer grace for one another and to more deeply engage with all that might be happening in the world so that we can decide together the type of home that we want to build and then live within. So my prayer for us this day is that we might just be open our hearts, minds, and imaginations to all that might be happening in our midst, the opportunities to offer grace and hope, peace and love, and to receive those things from unexpected places and people too. May this prayer be so. Amen.